They don't become obsessed when you love them more. They become obsessed the moment they realize they can no longer control how you feel. One surprisingly simple change in your behavior can completely disrupt the psychological pattern a narcissist depends on. It is not revenge. It is not manipulation. It is something far more powerful, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it works. If you've ever wondered why someone ignored you until you started moving on, why they suddenly returned after weeks or months of silence, or why they seemed far more interested once you stopped chasing them, you're witnessing a pattern that repeats itself in narcissistic relationships every single day. What looks like renewed love is often something entirely different. Beneath the charm, apologies, and sudden attention is a desperate attempt to restore something they believe they have lost. Understanding that difference changes everything, because once you see the pattern, it becomes almost impossible to unsee it. Stay with me until the end, because the final insight explains why many people accidentally pull themselves back into the cycle just when they were about to become completely free. Many people believe a narcissist is searching for love, affection, or emotional closeness, but what they are often seeking is something entirely different. At the center of their relationships is the need to feel powerful through control. Love requires vulnerability, equality, empathy, and mutual respect. Control requires only one thing: making another person's emotional state depend on them. That distinction explains why so many people leave narcissistic relationships feeling confused. They gave more love, more patience, more understanding, yet the relationship became increasingly unstable instead of healthier. A narcissistic person often measures success not by the depth of connection, but by the level of influence they have over another person's emotions. If they can make you anxious with silence, relieved by a text message, excited by a compliment, or devastated by criticism, they experience a powerful sense of psychological importance. Your emotional reactions become evidence that they still occupy the center of your attention. This is why they may alternate between warmth and coldness without warning. The inconsistency is not random. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty encourages people to seek reassurance. The more reassurance you seek from them, the more central they become in your emotional world. This dynamic explains why healthy, stable love often feels uninteresting to someone who thrives on control. In a balanced relationship, both people are free to have opinions, boundaries, friendships, and emotional independence. There is no constant struggle for dominance because neither partner needs to prove superiority. For a narcissistic individual, however, equality can feel like a loss of influence. If they cannot predict your reactions or dictate the emotional climate of the relationship, they may experience discomfort instead of security. This is also why genuine acts of love are sometimes ignored while emotional reactions receive immediate attention. Calm conversations may be dismissed, but tears, pleading, repeated explanations, or desperate attempts to fix the relationship often receive a response because those moments confirm that they still have emotional leverage. The relationship gradually shifts away from mutual care and toward emotional management, where one person is constantly trying to regain stability while the other quietly benefits from remaining the source of both comfort and distress. Understanding this pattern is important because it changes how you interpret their behavior. Instead of asking why your love was never enough, you begin asking a more accurate question: who benefited from keeping you emotionally off balance? That shift removes unnecessary self-blame. It reveals that the relationship was often sustained less by genuine intimacy and more by an ongoing cycle in which emotional dependence became the currency that maintained the narcissist's sense of significance and control. The simple act that disrupts a narcissist's expectations is refusing to make your emotional state available for their management. This does not mean becoming cold, cruel, or emotionally unavailable. It means responding instead of reacting. It means no longer allowing your peace to rise and fall based on their approval, attention, or unpredictable behavior. For someone who has grown accustomed to controlling the emotional atmosphere of a relationship, this shift can be deeply unsettling because it removes the pattern they have come to expect. Narcissistic dynamics often follow a predictable cycle. They may criticize you and expect you to defend yourself for hours. They may withdraw affection and anticipate that you will chase them, apologize, or desperately try to repair the connection. They may disappear without explanation, assuming that their return will be welcomed without accountability. These expectations are built over time through repeated interactions. Every emotional reaction reinforces the belief that they can influence your behavior whenever they choose. When you calmly decline to participate in that cycle, something changes. Instead of arguing endlessly, you set a clear boundary. Instead of flooding them with messages after they go silent, you continue living your life. Instead of trying to convince them of your worth, you recognize that your value does not require their validation. This quiet consistency interrupts the psychological script they have relied upon. They are no longer interacting with the version of you that could be easily pulled into emotional chaos. They are facing someone who has become emotionally grounded. This change is often confusing for a narcissist because much of their confidence depends on predictability. They expect familiar reactions, familiar fears, and familiar attempts to regain their approval. When those responses disappear, they lose an important source of certainty. They may test your boundaries more aggressively, increase their charm, make unexpected promises, or even become unusually attentive. These behaviors are not always signs of genuine personal growth. They are often attempts to determine whether the old patterns can still be restored. What makes this simple act so powerful is that it cannot be faked for long. Pretending not to care while secretly hoping to provoke a reaction is still emotional dependence. Genuine emotional independence comes from accepting that another person's opinion, approval, or rejection no longer determines your sense of self. Your choices become guided by your values rather than your fear of losing them. Once that happens, the balance of power begins to shift naturally because your emotional stability no longer depends on someone else's willingness to give or withhold attention. A narcissist often depends on certainty more than people realize. They want to know that a certain comment will upset you, that a period of silence will make you reach out, or that a small amount of attention will immediately restore their place in your life. This predictability gives them a sense of control over the relationship. When your emotional responses become consistent in the way they expect, they learn which buttons to push and when to push them. Over time, this creates a cycle in which your reactions become increasingly automatic while their behavior becomes increasingly calculated. Emotional non-reactivity quietly dismantles that pattern. It is not emotional suppression, pretending nothing hurts, or becoming indifferent. It is the ability to experience your emotions without allowing them to dictate your immediate behavior. You may still feel disappointed, frustrated, or even deeply hurt, but instead of reacting impulsively, you pause, reflect, and choose a response that aligns with your values rather than your emotions. From the narcissist's perspective, this makes you unexpectedly difficult to predict. Uncertainty is uncomfortable for someone who relies on emotional leverage. If they criticize you and you calmly acknowledge their words without becoming defensive, they lose the conflict they expected to have. If they attempt to provoke jealousy and you refuse to compete for their attention, the strategy produces little reward. If they suddenly return after a period of silence and you respond with calm boundaries instead of overwhelming relief, they are left without the emotional confirmation they anticipated. The familiar script no longer unfolds as planned, and that uncertainty can become deeply frustrating. This is one reason some narcissists appear to increase their efforts when they stop getting the reactions they want. They may become unusually charming one day and unexpectedly hostile the next. They may send confusing messages, create unnecessary drama, or attempt to provoke emotional conversations that pull you back into old patterns. These behaviors are often attempts to discover whether the previous methods of influence still work. They are searching for evidence that your emotional world can once again be shaped by their actions. The most important part of emotional non-reactivity is that it comes from inner stability rather than performance. If you are silently waiting for them to notice your calm so they will chase you, your emotional focus is still centered on them. Genuine non-reactivity shifts your attention back to yourself. You become more interested in protecting your peace than proving a point, more committed to your boundaries than winning an argument, and more invested in your emotional health than in decoding every move they make. That quiet self-possession creates uncertainty because it removes the predictable emotional patterns that once gave the narcissist a sense of influence over your life. Many people believe that confronting a narcissist head-on is the most effective way to regain control. They imagine that exposing every lie, proving every contradiction, or winning every argument will finally force accountability. While direct confrontation may sometimes be necessary to establish boundaries or protect yourself, it rarely changes the underlying dynamic. In fact, intense confrontations often provide exactly what a narcissist is seeking: emotional engagement. Whether the attention comes through anger, tears, lengthy explanations, or repeated attempts to make them understand, they remain at the center of your emotional world. The conversation may feel productive to you, but to them, it often confirms that they still have the ability to influence your thoughts and feelings. Unpredictability works differently because it quietly removes the certainty they have come to rely on. It is not about acting mysterious or playing games. It is about becoming less emotionally available to the patterns that once controlled you. When your behavior is guided by your own values instead of by their actions, your responses naturally become less predictable from their perspective. They no longer know whether criticism will upset you, whether silence will make you chase them, or whether sudden affection will erase previous mistreatment. That uncertainty disrupts the emotional blueprint they have depended on. Consider someone who always rushes to resolve every disagreement. A narcissist quickly learns that withdrawing affection or creating tension will cause that person to pursue reconciliation. Once this pattern is established, the narcissist can use it repeatedly because the outcome is almost guaranteed. But imagine that the same person begins responding differently. Instead of chasing after every conflict, they calmly acknowledge the disagreement, maintain their routine, and wait until a respectful conversation is possible. The narcissist suddenly loses confidence in predicting the outcome. The old strategy no longer guarantees the same emotional reward. This unpredictability is powerful because it is rooted in authenticity rather than manipulation. You are not changing your behavior to confuse the other person. You are changing because you are no longer willing to sacrifice your emotional well-being to keep the relationship stable. Your decisions become consistent with your principles, even if those decisions surprise someone who expected unlimited access to your time, attention, and emotional energy. As this pattern continues, the narcissist often increases attempts to regain certainty. They may alternate between charm and criticism, affection and distance, promises and disappointment. These shifts are frequently efforts to identify which approach will restore the familiar dynamic. When none of those strategies reliably produce the reactions they once did, they are left facing something they struggle to tolerate, a person whose emotional life is no longer organized around their need for control. If this is helping you understand patterns you've struggled to explain for years, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment with the word freedom. It tells me you're choosing clarity over confusion and peace over emotional chaos. Now let's uncover the simple act that changes the entire psychological dynamic. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have after learning about narcissistic behavior is believing they must become equally manipulative to protect themselves. They begin to think the answer is withholding affection to create anxiety, ignoring messages to provoke curiosity, or deliberately making the narcissist jealous. While these tactics may temporarily attract attention, they do not create emotional freedom. They simply replace one unhealthy dynamic with another. The relationship remains centered on control instead of respect, and both people become trapped in a cycle where every action is designed to influence the other's emotions rather than express honesty. Healthy detachment is fundamentally different. It is not about making someone miss you or keeping them emotionally off balance. It is about recognizing that your emotional stability cannot depend on another person's approval, affection, or unpredictable behavior. Detachment means you stop measuring your worth by how often they text, how warmly they speak to you, or whether they choose to stay. Your sense of identity begins to come from your own values, relationships, and inner confidence rather than from their changing opinions. Manipulation always has an audience in mind. Every action is taken with the hope of producing a specific reaction. You wait for them to notice your silence, become jealous of your success, or regret losing you. Even if you appear calm on the outside, your attention remains fixed on their next move. In that sense, they still occupy the center of your emotional world because your decisions are being shaped by what you hope they will think or feel. Healthy detachment shifts your focus completely. Instead of asking how your behavior will affect them, you begin asking whether your choices are healthy for you. You respond because a response reflects your character, not because you are trying to trigger guilt. You establish boundaries because they protect your well-being, not because you expect them to beg for another chance. You walk away from disrespect because your standards have changed, not because leaving is part of a strategy to make them return. This distinction matters because narcissistic individuals are often highly sensitive to manipulation from others. If they recognize that you are trying to outplay them, the relationship frequently becomes an escalating contest for control. Each person attempts to gain the upper hand, and genuine communication disappears. The emotional exhaustion that follows can be just as damaging as the original pattern. Real strength comes from becoming emotionally unavailable to unhealthy dynamics without becoming emotionally unavailable as a person. You remain capable of kindness, empathy, and connection, but those qualities are no longer offered at the expense of your self-respect. Your boundaries are not punishments, your silence is not a weapon, and your distance is not a performance. They are natural expressions of someone who has decided that peace is more valuable than winning a psychological game. One of the most confusing experiences people describe after distancing themselves from a narcissist is watching that person suddenly become intensely interested again. They may begin calling more often, sending long emotional messages, making unexpected promises, or showing levels of attention they never demonstrated before. It can feel as though they have finally realized your value. While genuine change is possible in rare situations when someone accepts responsibility and commits to long-term personal growth, a sudden surge of attention immediately after losing access to you is often driven by something else. It is frequently a response to the loss of emotional influence rather than the discovery of deeper love. For a narcissist, your emotional responses provide reassurance that they still matter in your psychological world. Every argument, every attempt to explain yourself, every plea for understanding, and every effort to regain their affection confirms that they continue to occupy a central place in your attention. When those reactions disappear, an uncomfortable question emerges in their mind. Have I lost my ability to affect this person? That uncertainty can become intensely unsettling because much of their confidence has been built upon knowing they could reliably shape your emotional experience. This is why emotional independence often appears to increase their interest. They notice that you are no longer immediately available to soothe their ego or stabilize their sense of importance. Your life continues without constant reference to them. You stop reacting to every criticism, you no longer rush to repair every conflict, and you become less invested in convincing them of your worth. From their perspective, something valuable has become inaccessible. Human beings often place greater value on what they can no longer easily obtain, and this tendency can become especially pronounced in relationships where control has been a defining feature. That heightened attention, however, should not automatically be confused with healthy attachment. Obsession is not the same as love. A person can become intensely focused on regaining access to someone without developing greater empathy, accountability, or respect. They may miss the influence they once had far more than they miss the mutual connection itself. This is why some narcissists seem passionately committed to winning someone back, only to return to old patterns once they feel secure again. The urgency fades because the goal was never emotional intimacy. It was the restoration of a familiar dynamic. Recognizing this difference protects you from misinterpreting renewed pursuit as evidence of lasting transformation. Lasting change is demonstrated through consistent accountability, respect for boundaries, empathy during conflict, and a willingness to accept consequences without manipulation. Intense attention by itself proves very little. The true measure of growth is not how desperately someone tries to regain your presence, but how consistently they treat you with dignity when they no longer fear losing control. Healthy boundaries are often misunderstood by people who have spent years in emotionally controlling relationships. They may think a boundary is a threat, an ultimatum, or an attempt to punish another person. In reality, a boundary is simply a clear statement of what you will and will not accept, followed by actions that consistently support that decision. It is not about controlling someone else's behavior. It is about taking responsibility for your own. This distinction becomes especially important when dealing with a narcissist, because boundaries remove the unlimited access they have become accustomed to having over your time, emotions, and attention. A narcissist often assumes that previous patterns will continue indefinitely. If criticism has always been tolerated, they expect it to remain tolerated. If emotional outbursts have always been forgiven without accountability, they expect the same outcome again. If disappearing for days has always been followed by your eager return, they begin to see that response as predictable. Boundaries interrupt these expectations. They communicate that access to your life is no longer automatic and that respect is no longer optional. When you calmly enforce a boundary, the narcissist is forced to confront something they have often avoided: consequences. Instead of endless conversations that lead nowhere, your actions become clear and consistent. If they insult you, you end the conversation. If they repeatedly violate your trust, you reduce your availability. If they ignore your clearly expressed limits, you stop participating in the interaction. These responses are not acts of revenge. They are decisions that protect your emotional well-being without requiring the other person to agree with you. This loss of unrestricted access can be deeply unsettling for someone who has relied on influence as a source of security. They may react with anger, disbelief, guilt-inducing statements, excessive charm, or dramatic promises of change. These reactions often reflect an attempt to restore the previous dynamic rather than a genuine willingness to respect your needs. The important point is not which strategy they choose. The important point is that your boundary has changed the relationship. They are no longer interacting with someone who automatically adjusts their life to accommodate unhealthy behavior. Consistent boundaries also transform your own thinking. Instead of constantly asking how to keep the peace, you begin asking what protects your peace. Instead of measuring success by whether the relationship remains intact, you measure it by whether you remain emotionally healthy and true to your values. This shift strengthens your confidence because your decisions become rooted in self-respect rather than fear of rejection. Over time, boundaries reveal truths that words alone cannot. People who genuinely value you learn to respect them even if it takes adjustment. Those who depended on unlimited access often reveal the depth of their need for control by resisting every reasonable limit, making it increasingly clear that what they wanted was not mutual respect, but unrestricted influence over your emotional life. The greatest mistake many people make after escaping a narcissistic relationship is believing that success is measured by whether the narcissist comes back, apologizes, or becomes obsessed with them. While it is understandable to want validation after months or even years of confusion, making the narcissist's reaction your goal keeps your emotional life connected to the very person you are trying to move beyond. Your happiness remains dependent on what they choose to do next. Real healing begins when their decisions no longer determine your sense of worth, your confidence, or your peace. This is why emotional freedom is so much more valuable than emotional victory. Emotional victory is about proving a point. It wants the narcissist to regret losing you, to admit they were wrong, or to recognize everything they failed to appreciate. Emotional freedom no longer needs those outcomes. It accepts that another person's inability to value you does not reduce your value. It understands that closure does not always come from receiving answers. Sometimes it comes from no longer needing them. A narcissist often expects former partners to remain psychologically available long after the relationship has changed. They may assume that a single message, a vague apology, or a nostalgic memory will reopen the emotional connection. That expectation is built on past experiences in which access to your emotions was almost guaranteed. When you have truly healed, those attempts lose much of their influence. You may acknowledge the message without feeling compelled to return. You may remember the good moments without ignoring the harmful ones. You may wish them well without believing you are responsible for fixing them. This kind of freedom changes every future relationship as well. You become less attracted to intensity disguised as intimacy. You stop confusing inconsistency with passion or unpredictability with excitement. Instead, you begin to appreciate qualities that once seemed ordinary but are actually the foundation of healthy relationships. Consistency, honesty, emotional safety, mutual respect, and accountability. Your standards become stronger because your self-worth is no longer built upon earning acceptance from someone who repeatedly withheld it. Ironically, this is often the point where the narcissist notices the greatest change. They no longer see someone waiting for validation or searching for signs that the relationship can be repaired at any cost. They see someone who has built a life that is not organized around their approval. Whether that causes them to become curious, frustrated, or even temporarily obsessed becomes far less important because your direction is no longer determined by their attention. The ultimate achievement is not becoming unforgettable in the narcissist's mind. It is reaching a place where your peace cannot be negotiated, your boundaries cannot be bought with temporary affection, and your identity is no longer defined by someone else's inability to love with consistency, empathy, and respect. The greatest shift you will ever make is realizing that the simple act capable of changing the entire dynamic is not chasing harder, arguing better, proving your worth, or finding the perfect words. It is reclaiming ownership of your emotional life. The moment your peace no longer depends on another person's approval, the relationship changes whether they accept it or not. Their power was never in their charm, their silence, or their unpredictability. Their power existed only as long as your emotional world revolved around their behavior. If a narcissist becomes obsessed because they can no longer control you, remember that their obsession is not your destination. Your destination is freedom. Obsession is their experience. Peace is yours. Never confuse someone wanting access to you with someone being capable of loving you in a healthy way. Lasting love is measured by consistency, accountability, empathy, and respect, not by intensity, pursuit, or emotional drama. As you move forward, ask yourself one question whenever doubt begins to creep in. Does this bring me closer to peace or pull me back into confusion? That single question can become your compass. Every healthy choice strengthens your confidence. Every boundary reinforces your self-respect. Every decision to protect your emotional well-being reminds you that your value has never depended on another person's ability to recognize it. If this message gave you clarity, share it with someone who may still be trapped in the cycle of emotional control. Leave a comment with the word freedom to declare that you are choosing self-respect over approval, boundaries over chaos, and healing over unhealthy attachment. Subscribe for more insights into human behavior, emotional resilience, and psychological patterns that empower you to build healthier relationships and a stronger, more peaceful life.